The topic of this talk is leaky mitochondrial membranes, subtitle, Why Are Mammals Warm? Okay, leaky membranes. So this is a picture of the typical mitochondrion with the outer membrane in green and the inner membrane in red. And as we know from our previous work, NADP is produced from the breakdown of sugars in the Krebs cycle, and the NADP is split into three species: the NAD+, the H+ ion, and the electrons. The role of the electrons is to go bump through the membrane proteins to power the hydrogen ion pump, which is illustrated here in red. And after the electrons continue their way, they power several pumps, and then the electrons keep flowing around the membrane until they get to a final protein. And let me show you what that does. Okay, backing up just a little bit, the second species is the hydrogen ion, and it's produced, and the power of the electrons causes the hydrogen ion to go through the pump to the outer membrane space. So over time, this gets pressurized with many hydrogen ions. Some of them are also going through this pump. There are many pumps, and the electrons are what enable these hydrogen ions to get pumped out into this outer space. Eventually, the hydrogen ions are going to flow around this high concentration to low concentration gradient, so they're going to go through an enzyme called ATP synthase, and they end up back on the inside. It's the motion of the hydrogen ions through ATP synthase that causes ADP to be connected with its phosphate to store energy as ATP. Now, as mentioned before, the electrons power the H+ pump, and eventually the electrons are going to go bumpity-bump to this final membrane protein that I mentioned, and the electrons are going to be deposited inside along with the hydrogen ion. The final step is for oxygen to be brought into the cell and into the mitochondrial space. So we're going to enter oxygen, and we combine all three of these together, and we make water. All right, now that's how the mitochondrion is supposed to work, and the main goal is to make ATP. But I haven't talked about leaky membranes yet. What happens in a leaky membrane is that the hydrogen ions, instead of going through the pump, leak through the membrane at random spots. Let me show you that. Okay, here's a blow up of part of the membrane showing the ATP synthase. What's supposed to happen is the hydrogen ions are supposed to go through ATP synthase, but sometimes they don't. And instead of going through there, they just kind of wiggle their way between the phospholipid molecules. And in the process of doing that, it causes the tails of the phospholipids in that vicinity to start vibrating with more energy. Basically, the Brownian motion has increased in this region. That leads to an increase in temperature. All right. Well, what else is going on here? We haven't made any ATP because the hydrogen ions are not going through the proper channel. Okay, so it looks like the membrane is not quite doing its job. You might think this is bad. Well, probably the membranes of all organisms leak hydrogen ions to some degree. If you want to make ATP, the hydrogen ions must go through the ATP synthase. But they don't all do that, and some of them, as you can see in the drawing, leak through the phospholipid bilayer, causing the molecular motion to increase, which is a measure of temperature. And indeed, that can be very helpful for mammals, especially. We're warm-blooded, and the body heat that we generate is produced in this fashion. Other creatures like reptiles or insects that don't have elevated body temperature wouldn't have as much leakiness happening in their membranes, but yet we can do things that they can't. Our elevated body temperature causes all our various chemical reactions to go faster, work at a higher performance level. So that's my little story on why mammals are warm.